Before the story begins, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. What time do you usually watch videos? And don't forget to suggest the next story or content you'd like to see. Story 1. The Shape That Stood Beyond the Curtains. It began with something so simple that most people would have ignored it, just a fleeting outline, a shadow where there should have been none. Yet for Emily, it became the first warning of many long nights that left her terrified of her own bedroom window. She had just moved into a small house that sat at the very end of a quiet street. The neighborhood was old, the kind of place where street lamps gave off a weak yellow glow and the trees seemed to lean too close to the windows. The house itself was cozy, but her bedroom faced the street, and her only separation from the outside world was a thin set of beige curtains. They had come with the house, and though she had thought about replacing them, she never did. The first night, it was raining. Emily lay in bed listening to the steady patter against the glass when she noticed movement. A shape, tall and unmistakably human, passed across the curtains. She froze. Her logical mind told her it was a trick of the rain, a passing car's headlights, or maybe just her imagination. But the more she stared, the more she became certain someone was standing outside her window. She didn't move. Her breath grew shallow, and her heart hammered so loud she thought whoever, or whatever it was, could hear it. She waited for the sound of footsteps on the porch or the creak of movement, but none came. After nearly an hour of paralyzed silence, the shape was gone. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been nothing. She went outside, checked the damp grass below her window, and saw no footprints. She almost laughed at herself. But when night fell again, she couldn't shake the memory of that shadow. On the second night, it returned. This time, she was reading in bed with a small lamp glowing when the shape appeared again, darker than the dim light filtering through the curtain. The outline was too defined to be mistaken. Tall shoulders, a head slightly tilted, as if it was leaning close, watching. Emily dropped her book, her fingers trembling, and whispered to herself, "It's not real. It's not real." She forced herself to rush forward, pulling the curtain back in one swift motion. Nothing. The night outside was empty, just the stillness of the street, the dripping leaves, and the weak glow of the lamppost. Her breath fogged the cold glass as she pressed against it, scanning for movement. There was no one. But when she returned to bed, she noticed something chilling. The faint imprint of a hand smeared across the outside of the window pane, as though someone had rested their palm against it. Emily told herself it was a prank, maybe kids from the neighborhood. She even checked with her neighbor the next day, but they laughed and said no one played around there. Too quiet, too empty, too forgotten. The third night, Emily kept the light off. She wanted to prove to herself it wasn't real, that it was all in her head. She lay in the dark, her blankets pulled to her chin, watching the faint ripple of the curtains. Hours passed, and just when her eyelids grew heavy, she saw it again. The shadow appeared, darker than the night, pressing close enough that she could see the faint outline of fingers brushing the fabric. The curtains swayed, not from any breeze. Her windows were sealed shut, but from something pressing against them from the outside. She sat frozen, every instinct telling her not to move, not to breathe, not to let it know she was awake. But then she heard it, breathing. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. The sound of someone exhaling just on the other side of the thin curtain. Emily bolted upright, grabbed her phone, and flicked on the flashlight. She shined it directly at the window. The shadow vanished instantly, like it had never been there. Her heart was racing as she called a friend, voice trembling, asking them to come over. But by the time anyone arrived, the house looked perfectly normal. Her friend insisted she was just stressed, well, maybe overtired from the move. Emily wanted to believe them, but the handprint was back the next morning, clearer than before, with long streaks dragging down the glass as though someone had let their fingers slide slowly away. For weeks, it happened again and again, always at night, always outside the same window. Sometimes it would vanish when she pulled the curtains aside. Other times, it lingered, the breathing audible, the pressure against the fabric visible. She tried filming it, but every time she aimed her phone, the camera showed nothing more than a still, empty window. Her breaking point came one stormy evening. The wind howled outside, rattling the trees, and she decided she wouldn't let it scare her anymore. She turned on every light in the house and sat in her bedroom with the curtains wide open. For hours, nothing happened. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning. She almost laughed at herself for being so paranoid. Then, at 3:07 a.m., the street lamp outside flickered and went out. The world outside her window plunged into complete blackness. Emily froze, her skin prickling with dread. And then, pressed against the glass, she saw it. Not a shadow, but something solid, a figure standing so close its outline consumed the window. There were no features she could make out, only the broad silhouette of a person. The worst part was the sound, a slow, wet drag of fingernails scraping against the glass. Emily screamed and ran from the room, dialing the police with shaking hands. They arrived quickly, sweeping the area with flashlights, checking every corner of the property. But there was no one. No footprints, no broken locks, no signs of forced entry. The officers told her it was likely her imagination, maybe the storm making shadows look alive. Emily didn't argue. She didn't sleep either. The next morning, she decided she couldn't live there anymore. She packed her belongings, shaking with exhaustion, and as she carried the last box to her car, she glanced back at the bedroom window one final time. The curtains were drawn, though she was certain she had left them open. And as she stood there in the daylight, frozen on the curb, she saw it, the shape standing behind the curtains, perfectly still, as though it was watching her leave. Her throat went dry. She didn't go back inside. Emily left that house for good, abandoning the rest of her belongings. She never found out who or what had been standing outside her window night after night. But sometimes, late at night, in her new apartment across town, she swears she hears it again. The faint sound of breathing, just outside the glass. Story 2. The Shadow on the 12th Floor. The 12th floor was never meant to be occupied. That was what the maintenance staff always said, usually with a nervous shrug, like it was both a joke and a warning. The building itself was a relic from the late 1960s, a high-rise downtown office tower that had been renovated countless times, its exterior glass panes tinted and mirrored to keep the sun out. 11 of the floors were bustling with lawyers, accountants, and architects. But the 12th? No company ever stayed there longer than a few months. For Daniel, a newly hired night security guard, it was just another shift. He'd been told to make his rounds every hour, and though the 12th floor wasn't rented out, protocol required that he check it anyway. The elevator doors opened reluctantly with a groan when he pressed 12. Inside, the hallway lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow against the carpet. The first thing he noticed was the stillness. Not the kind of quiet where you could hear distant cars honking from the street below, but a suffocating silence that pressed in on him. He walked down the corridor, flashlight in hand, brushing past doors marked only with numbers. At the far end, near an emergency exit, he stopped. The glass window overlooking the city was black, reflecting only his own face, and then something else. A shadow. It wasn't his. It stretched across the glass as if someone stood just behind him, taller, its head tilted at an odd angle. Daniel spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark hallway. Nothing. Empty space, just peeling wallpaper and shut doors. He told himself the reflection was distorted, that shadows played tricks when the lights flickered. Still, his chest tightened. Over the next week, he began to dread his trips to the 12th floor. Always at the end of the hall. Always in that same spot, he saw the shape. Sometimes it looked like it was standing closer than before. Once, it seemed to be pressed right up against the glass, its shoulders hunched, watching the streets below. He never reported it. Who would believe him? Instead, he told himself he was tired, that late-night shifts were warping his perception. But then came the night when the building felt wrong from the start. The elevators shuddered. The stairwell smelled faintly of something metallic, like rust or blood. When he arrived at the 12th floor, the door was already ajar. That was impossible. He always checked. He always locked it. Daniel pushed it open, and the stale air met him like a wall. The hallway lights were dimmer than usual. His flashlight flickered even though the batteries were fresh. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the carpet, each sound too loud in the oppressive silence. And then, footsteps. Not his own. Soft, deliberate, just behind him. He spun around, but there was only the empty stretch of corridor. The sound had stopped the moment he turned. His throat went dry. He whispered to himself, "Just the pipes! Just the pipes!" But then the reflection in the window moved. Daniel froze. The shadow was there again. Tall, wrong, its arms too long, its head cocked as if listening. But this time, when he lifted his flashlight, it didn't vanish. It stood still, etched into the glass, even as the beam passed through it. His breath came fast. He told himself to leave, to walk back into the elevator, ride it down, and never look back. But his feet betrayed him. They carried him closer to the end of the hall, closer to the reflection. The nearer he got, the more he realized it wasn't a reflection at all. The thing wasn't behind him. It was inside the glass, pressed between the surface and the night sky beyond, as though trapped in the pane itself. Its hands pushed faintly against the interior, fingers long, palms flat, and then it breathed. The condensation fogged the glass from the inside. Words traced themselves into the mist. At first, Daniel couldn't understand them, but slowly, letters formed. 2 words, "Let me." He stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the wall. The shadow's head twitched violently, like it was shaking against invisible restraints. The words smeared, then rewrote themselves. "Let me out." The glass shuddered under a pressure that shouldn't have been possible. The sound of creaking filled the hallway as though the entire window would burst outward. Daniel bolted for the elevator, his pulse hammering. He slapped the button again and again, but the doors were agonizingly slow. Behind him, the thud of something heavy struck the glass, once, twice, again. When the elevator finally opened, he lunged inside, slamming the button for the lobby. The doors closed just as the glass shattered upstairs. He didn't see it, but he heard it. The sharp crack, the rush of displaced air, and the sound of something stepping free. The next morning, when Daniel returned to collect his belongings, the 12th floor looked pristine. No broken glass, no fogged words, just silence. When he asked the supervisor about the window, the man frowned. "There's no window at the end of that hall. There never has been." Daniel never worked another night shift. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, the day staff began whispering about the 12th floor again. Tenants on the 11th swore they heard footsteps pacing overhead, even though no one was supposed to be there. A receptionist claimed she saw a figure moving behind the glass from the street below, tall, thin, with its head bent to the side, staring down. And every night at 3:12 a.m., the cameras aimed at the 12th floor hallway glitched, static filling the feed until the minute passed. When the video returned, the hallway always looked empty. Always, except for one frame, halfway through the interference. A single still image of a man, Daniel, standing frozen at the end of the corridor, his face pale, his eyes wide, as the shadow loomed behind him. Story 3. The figure that followed the glass. It was well past midnight when Marcus sat slouched on his couch, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the city through the wide living room window. His apartment was on the 18th floor, high enough that the streetlights looked like distant orange stars scattered across the dark veins of the avenues. The reflection of the city bled faintly into the glass of his window, and for the longest time, that was all he saw: lights, shadows, and his own tired face. But then he noticed something else. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, an effect of drinking late, maybe, or the sleepless haze that had become his constant companion. In the glass, beyond his own reflection, a darker shape lingered. It wasn't his shadow, nor the furniture behind him. It was taller, elongated. It stood as though pressed against the glass, as if it had been waiting there the whole time. Marcus turned instantly, scanning the room. Empty. He laughed nervously to himself, exhaling through clenched teeth, and shook his head. Of course, it was just a trick of light, a shadow from another building. He downed what remained in the glass, placed it on the coffee table, and tried to ignore the unease curling in his gut. But when he glanced back, the shape was still there. And this time, it had shifted. It was closer. Its outline sharper. Not the vague blur of a reflection, but something defined, broad shoulders tapering down to an unnaturally thin frame. There were no details of its face, but Marcus swore he could sense eyes staring back through the glass. He pressed forward, putting his hands against the cold surface of the window. Outside, there was nothing, just the skyline, the night, and the empty air 18 stories above the ground. But in the reflection, The figure was leaning forward too, mirroring his movements. Marcus staggered back, heart thundering in his chest. He didn't want to look again, but his eyes disobeyed him. He peeked cautiously at the glass. The figure was inside now. It no longer stood on the other side of the window, but lurked in the reflection just behind him, closer than any intruder had a right to be. He spun around, every muscle tense, expecting, needing to see someone in his apartment. But again, the room was empty. His bookshelves, the couch, the television, all untouched. And yet, in the reflection, the thing was still there, a silent companion that didn't belong. Marcus grabbed his phone, fumbling with his shaking hands, and dialed his friend Erica. She answered groggily after a few rings. "Marcus, it's 2 a.m. What's wrong?" I don't know. There's something in my apartment. No, not in my apartment, on the glass. It's following me." "What do you mean, following you?" "I see it when I look at the window, but when I turn around, there's nothing." His voice cracked. "But it's moving. It's closer." Erica tried to calm him, telling him it was probably his reflection, or maybe just the whiskey. But Marcus couldn't shake the certainty building in his bones. He set the phone down on speaker mode and forced himself to test something. He walked across the room, away from the window. His reflection moved, as expected, but the figure didn't. It lingered near the glass, unmoving, almost patient. Only when Marcus turned his head back did it tilt, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging his attention. "Marcus? Talk to me. What's happening?" Erica's voice strained through the phone. Marcus's throat tightened. "It doesn't move when I do. It's not me. It's not." He stopped short, words dying as he realized something horrifying. "Oh God, it's getting closer to the couch." He watched as the figure, once pressed against the glass, now seemed to drift forward in the reflection. Its steps made no sound, but its presence grew heavier, thickening the air like humidity before a storm. It stood near the couch, then nearer to the coffee table, and then right behind where Marcus stood. He spun around, every nerve in his body screaming. Nothing, just air. But his reflection told a different story. The figure towered over him now, an eclipse of shadow with edges that seemed to bleed into the room itself. Marcus grabbed his phone. "Erica, it's right behind me. I can see it in the glass." "Get out of there. Right now, Marcus. Just go." Before she could finish, the call dropped. His phone screen froze, distorted, as though static had crawled into its circuits. He slammed it uselessly against the table. His breathing was ragged, eyes glued to the glass. And then the figure moved in a way that shattered everything he thought he understood about reflections. It stepped out of the glass. The surface rippled like disturbed water as the shadow peeled itself free, sliding into the room with an unnatural grace. The apartment lights flickered violently, plunging Marcus in and out of darkness as the thing straightened to its full, impossible height. There were no features to its face, just a blank void, but he felt eyes boring into him. Cold, ancient, unyielding. Marcus stumbled backward until he hit the wall, his chest heaving. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and hurled it at the figure. It passed straight through, shattering against the far wall, but the shadow didn't falter. It only leaned closer, its form bending and warping as if drinking in his terror. In desperation, Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. He told himself it wasn't real, that it was a hallucination, that if he ignored it long enough, it would vanish. When he opened them again, the apartment was calm, silent. The window showed only his reflection, shaken but alone. Marcus laughed weakly, a hollow sound that didn't belong in the quiet. He bent to pick up the pieces of the broken lamp, his body trembling from adrenaline. And then, in the corner of the glass, he saw it. The figure hadn't disappeared. It had only stepped aside, waiting, watching, closer to the window's edge as if biding its time. And this time, Marcus realized with a sinking dread, it wasn't just following him in the reflection. It was watching him in the dark spaces of his apartment too. The ones just beyond where the light could reach. Story 4. The Night Visitor at the Cabin Window. Evan never intended to stay the night at the cabin. It was a last-minute decision, brought on by exhaustion and a creeping fog that had swallowed the mountain road. The cabin belonged to his friend's family, unused for years, but Evan had the spare key. It was supposed to be a quiet, lonely refuge. Just 4 walls, a fireplace, and a bed where he could sleep until daylight. The place smelled of pine and damp wood when he stepped inside. Dust had gathered on every surface, and the silence was suffocating. He set his duffel bag on the couch, lit a lantern, and reassured himself. One night. Just one night. He tried to sleep almost immediately, but the forest outside the cabin was restless. Branches scraped against the roof. The wind howled through the trees like a voice trying to form words. At one point, he thought he heard footsteps in the dirt outside, but when he pressed his ear to the window pane, there was only the shifting sound of leaves. It was around midnight when he first heard the tap, a soft, deliberate knock against the glass. He sat upright in the bed, every nerve in his body alert. The lantern on the bedside table still glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the log walls. Evan told himself it had to be a branch, a tree limb brushing the glass, moved by the wind. But then it came again, 3 slow taps, like fingers testing the barrier between inside and out. Cautiously, he pushed himself out of bed, tiptoeing toward the window. The curtains were thin, almost sheer, and beyond them was nothing but blackness. He hesitated, hand trembling over the fabric. Something deep inside him screamed not to pull it aside, not to look. He didn't. He backed away instead, forcing himself to laugh softly at his own nerves. "It's nothing," he whispered. "Just the trees." But the tapping continued. Not frantic, not random, rhythmic, patient. Almost as if someone was standing just outside, waiting for him to answer. Evan pulled a chair against the door, securing it as best he could, though the lock was sturdy. He tried to drown out the sound with the blanket pulled over his head, but he could still hear it. And worse, the faint rasp of breath fogging against the glass. When exhaustion finally overtook him, he slept in fits, jerking awake to silence, only for the tapping to return moments later. By 3 a.m, he broke. His nerves were shot, his chest tight with dread. He crept back toward the window, determined to fling the curtains open, to see what was out there, and end the torment once and for all. His fingers brushed the fabric. And then the tapping stopped. Dead silence pressed in, thick and unnatural. The woods outside were still. Even the wind had died. Evan held his breath, listening so hard his ears ached. For one moment he thought maybe, it was over. That's when the window pane shuddered. Not like a branch hitting it. Not like wind. It was a violent push, as though something had pressed its face hard against the glass from the outside. Evan stumbled backward, nearly falling over the chair. He didn't scream, didn't dare. The pane bulged inward with the pressure, and for the briefest second he saw it. A silhouette. Broad shoulders, a long face. Too tall, too still. It stood there against the glass, unmoving, but its presence radiated malice. The lantern's light barely illuminated it, but Evan could see enough to know this was no trick of shadow. Someone or something was outside his cabin window, and it had been waiting all along. The figure tilted its head slowly, the glass groaning under its weight. Then, as if satisfied that he had finally looked, it pulled back. Silence again. Evan collapsed into the bed, heart hammering so violently he thought he might pass out. He did not sleep for the rest of the night, lying rigid, staring at the ceiling, praying for the sun. When dawn finally broke, he rushed outside, desperate to prove it had been his imagination. But the dirt around the cabin told a different story. Beneath the window, pressed deep into the earth, were footprints. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. Long, narrow, impossibly large. They circled the cabin, that weaving back and forth, pausing beneath every window. He fled before breakfast, duffel bag forgotten, driving the twisting mountain road until the cabin was miles behind him. He never told his friend what he had seen, or what had seen him. But sometimes, years later, when sleep won't come, and the house is quiet, Evan swears he hears it again. A soft, patient tap at the glass. They say shadows vanish when the light touches them, but the ones you've heard tonight don't seem bound by that rule. These weren't tricks of the eyes or fleeting illusions. They lingered. They waited. They wanted to be seen. Maybe you've drawn your curtains tighter after listening, or maybe you'll find yourself glancing at the dark glass just a little longer tonight. Because once something presses its presence against your window, you can never quite forget that it's still out there, silent, patient, and watching.